Hello, listeners. I'm Samshrita.
I'm Rahini.
And I'm Isha.
Welcome to episode number one of So What's the Big Deal? The show where we talk about issues from a teenage point of view. Today, we're going to be talking about the topic that everyone in the US knows all too well: gun regulations and violence.
All right, to start us off, I think Isha will begin talking about the legislation on gun laws.
Well, yeah, and actually, I think I'd like to start with just some statistics before we get into some of the laws that have been recently passed. As we know all too well about the Uvalde and the Buffalo shootings, which have just recently happened, this has really spurred the nation to take action and for people to call for Congress and all of the federal government to take action against gun violence in the US because of how horrific both of these shootings were and how close they were. So, one of the things that I'd like to point out is that the total number of gun violence deaths that we've had so far in the US is 20,000 502, and the amount of mass shootings is 278. And I think this is just something that we need to look on as a nation because there's over like hundreds of shootings every single year that don't really decrease in numbers. And actually, as I'm looking at the shooting statistics, there's honestly, it's honestly been on a rise ever since 2014. Um, of course, we're only like halfway through the year as of now, but as from what I've seen since 2014, this is coming off from the Gun Violence Archive, by the way. Um, we've had over 50,000 incidents per year, especially there was a spike in 2017 with 58,110 gun violence incidents throughout the US. And so this has only steadily been on the rise with some dips here and there, but really, when we go into also the laws that have been passed, there have barely been any laws to address this issue because it's just such a widely debated issue across both of the parties. And
Yeah,
so,
something that I'd like to add just really quickly is that some research I did found statistics that guns are like the leading cause of death amongst American children and teens, and most of the victims of gun violence are usually 19 or younger. So this is really a crime epidemic that's impacting our future generations, and it's really something we need to focus on. And especially since we're all teenagers here, we all have to fear that at some point, and it's definitely an issue that I think that it's really cool that we're talking about. So we
yeah,
can continue.
and something that I'd like to point out is that 2014, which is how far back the Gun Violence Archive has, is that in 2014 there were 272 mass shootings. And as of 2021 had 692 mass shootings in total. So that's almost an increase of 400 mass shootings in the past almost decade. And already in 2022, there's already been 278. There's already almost been as many shootings halfway throughout the year now as there have been back in 2014. I think that's just something that we need to sit down and think about is that this number doesn't go down. It's gone up throughout the years, which is kind of terrifying when you think about it. And the fact that no one's really done anything about it is really saddening. But thankfully, of course, it's sad that we have to have more shootings to wake up the nation, but thankfully, due to the impact that Uvalde and Buffalo left, the House actually passed a new gun violence law. And while it is small, it's pretty impactful still. It raised the age limit for purchasing a semi automatic rifle and it prohibited the sale of ammunition magazines with a capacity of more than 15 rounds. So, although this is small, I personally think that this is actually a pretty good step in the right direction, especially of how debatable gun violence and gun laws are in our country. And I just want to know, like, what do you guys think about this? Like, do you guys think this is a good impact? Do you think they should be doing more with the statistics?
I
Um,
honestly do think it is a good step. Any step towards a positive change is definitely a good step. But what I would like to focus in on is why exclusively this is like a trend in America itself. I know they do say state mental health as a problem for most of these, but it's not like people who suffer with mental health like only exist in the U.S., right? They do definitely exist other places of the world. Specifically, most with its other like equal counterparts in I think it was 1996 in Dunblane Primary School in Scotland. There was a school shooting, and it was like the deadliest mass shooting in UK history. And within the next year, the British Parliament had banned private ownership of most handguns, semi-automatic weapons, and even like installed mandatory registration for shotgun owners.
Yeah, I
I
think
believe
those are really
Australia also had something similar to that. And so, you know, with all of these other like same, I guess you could say like developed country like counterparts to the US, you know, they're pretty much in the same like same level as the US, you would say in most things. If these countries can find a solution to a problem that quickly arose, how come? Because since the most like our most notable school shooting was the Columbine shooting, right? Since then the number has only grown. It hasn't gone down. So there clearly something must be happening within like American society and politics itself that it's not just, you know, the people who are actually doing the crimes, but also people who are inadvertently like perpetuating the continuance of like gun violence and especially like gun related terrorism and school shootings, because this is kind of only like an American trend, like a very wayward side of American exceptionalism, I guess.
Yeah, like if I could add something, I think that's a really interesting point that you brought about like the UK willing to like take actual action within a year of like a mass shooting. But for us, for the US, it has been about like 10 years since the Sandy Hook Elementary massacre in 2012. And there has been not a singular piece of gun legislation that has been passed that has like actively impacted these values. Like as Isha mentioned, the number of school shootings is just increasing. And it's something that we really have to focus on is the legislation, because it's not just a mental health issue, it's not just like a misogyny issue or like even a white supremacy issue. It's a legislation issue because without the proper regulations, we will face more and more violence. Like even Canada, they have high levels of gun ownership, but they have regulations. So there's school shootings, there's shooting related violences are drastically less than the US. And that's like something that we should definitely point out as we move into legislation. So do you guys have any particular pieces of legislation you want to mention?
I don't have a particular
legislation,
piece.
but I would
Oh,
I would
well,
like to mention one thing, you know, and it clearly, you know, it every year, you know, with more and more school shootings happening, it's become like a public, you know, a paranoia, you know, like no parent has to send their kid to school. No student has to go to school thinking, yes, will this be my last day? Will I be safe? I just want to add like a little personal experience here. Um, I was like about 7 when Sandy Hook happened. It happened like half an hour away from my house, and it was like a state of paranoia. And I remember my school like implementing, you know, lockdowns and stuff just to make sure the building is more secure. But what I do realize is that it's kind of what happened afterwards is kind of in like accordance with what kind of pretty much happens with any other shooting. There's a panic in the community regarding like the safety of children, the safety of of society after a school shooting, and then it starts to like that same attentiveness and the same like urgency to fix this problem starts to wane, and it doesn't start picking up again until the next school shooting happens.
Yeah,
We should
exactly.
need
Like
to wait for another school shooting to happen.
once the social media attention of these like issues decrease, then um like all these gun regulations continue to face like traction in Congress and they're not passed and like nothing is done. It has been 10 years since Sandy Hook and like practically every American child has had to deal with some form of school violence or face like the necessity of learning how to protect themselves. I mean, for real, like at some point people were selling like bulletproof backpacks because people were genuinely fearing for their lives, and it's like an actual issue, but nothing has been done about it just because of the traction in Congress and the refusal of people to see that regulations will not take away your rights, but it will just improve and protect the American people, which is something that we should definitely talk about as we talk about like the political standpoints, because I know a lot of Republicans and Democrats are for improving gun regulations, but a lot of them fear that it's going to take away their right to own arms, which is a Second Amendment right, and it's like really a foundation of America. I think we need to overcome that fear, because honestly, there are so many more pros to gun regulations than there are cons.
Yeah, and I know people are like, maybe we should start like addressing, I know like mental health or other issues are sometimes pointed as to blame. But my logic here is that if a kid was running around with a knife, it's not the kid's fault. The kid doesn't know any better. This kid is like, let's say the kid is like a toddler, like 3-4 years old. He's running around with a knife in his hand. You wouldn't stop and educate the kid on why the knife is like dangerous, like when he has it, right? The first thing you would do is you would take the knife out of his hands, put it away somewhere where he can't reach it, and then you would tell him knives are bad, they hurt you, they can hurt other people. Okay, when you're more older and responsible to use a knife, like let's say the kid grows up and he wants to learn how to cook something, then he would need to use a knife to cut something up, right? So when he's like more older, more mature, and he can handle that, the responsibility of holding a knife in his hand, that's when you would give it to him. Same thing here. You wouldn't try and educate someone who's clearly not in the right mental space about why a gun isn't right. You would take the gun away from them first, then as soon as, because clearly mental health is still pretty much an issue. You would first educate them, make them realize why what they've done is wrong, why what they're about to do is wrong. And then once they become responsible, more mature, which we can help do by more gun regulations, then we can give it back to them if they decide to be more responsible citizens.
And actually, since you mentioned about kids running around, something that I'd like to talk about is another bill. Again, most of these are going to have to be bills because a lot of these either have been passed in the House, but they've still been debated about in the Senate. So this is a bill that was introduced, I believe, 2019. Yeah, and basically, context for this is that there's 15-year-old Ethan Song, and he lived in Connecticut, but he accidentally shot and killed himself with his friend's father's loaded rifle. So then what the legislation that was passed after this that requires storage of a weapon and a secure gun storage or safety device location in a residence where the minor who is under the age of 18 could potentially gain access, or if an adult resident is eligible to possess a firearm. So it requires that it has to be stored in a secure location. So I know that a lot of people would probably say that this sounds like a good law. You know, you want to keep your guns away from the kids who could possibly, again, take it, like for Ethan, as who could take it, think it's a toy, and then actually get themselves killed. But something that opponents say, one of the things that they say is that it's overly broad. And I think this is a good point to bring up, is that what some of the opponents say is the language is overly broad and that it could possibly criminalize anybody who owns the property of the house. Because what it says is that no person should store a loaded or unloaded firearm in premises that are under their control. And so opponents bring up a good point in that anybody could be controlled premises. You could say that you could have a babysitter over. And technically, if you have a babysitter over while the parents are out, then that means that the babysitter has temporarily given responsibility of controlling the house. And so then if the kid kills themselves on accident, then, you know, the babysitter could accidentally be criminalized. Or maybe the parents could be criminalized for not storing their gun in a safe location, even though maybe it's the babysitter who had to watch over them. So I just want to know, like, bills like this, what do you guys think about them? Like, do you think, for example, with this bill, do you think it's a good idea? Do you think they should be more specific? And then also, do you guys think that even with simple bills like this, do you think that any bills like this will have a chance of getting passed? Or will it be like a lot of the bills in the present where the House starts the talks, they start talking about them, there's hope because they actually pass through the House, but then it dies out in the Senate and then no one ever picks it up until like the next mass shooting happens?
Okay, actually, like, I was also planning on touching on this issue about gun storage because I have researched a little bit about like gun regulations in other nations, and a lot of other nations have like specific fire safety courses before you can buy a weapon. And in those courses, you're like taught how to manage your gun, how to keep it secure from like minors and children and people that shouldn't be touching it, and how you have to have like a specific container and you have to be really careful with it unless it's in use. And this applies to like handguns, rifles, hunting rifles, everything, like shotguns, everything. But the US, for getting a gun, you only really need a background check, and that is reported to take under 10 minutes, and you're giving an immediate response over the phone. Like you could literally do that and you could get a background check completed and you can buy a weapon like 5 minutes later. So the US does not have any like teaching moments to teach like gun owners that they need to protect their weapons like this. So I think even if that bill is passed, I feel like most of the people would not know how to properly handle their gun. So it would just end up with either like wrong criminalizations because people don't know how to protect their guns, or just I think it would be irrational to put this bill into place without like setting a course that everyone has to take and like make sure that everyone properly knows how to like control their weapons. Oh, so moving on, we're getting a little bit stuck on this issue, but I would like to talk about the legislation in the United States. I have a little bit about gun regulations, but if you guys want to like pop in and just say any rules or laws that you know about, that'd be cool. Like the basic US laws, it just kind of includes that you have to be 18 or older to purchase shotguns, rifles, or ammunition, but you have to be 21 or older to purchase handguns or other firearms, which I personally think is interesting because rifles can cause more damage than handguns, but you still have to be older to purchase a handgun. Usually people with like a history of substance abuse or a history of jail sentences and fugitives or even a history of being in a mental institution are rejected from purchasing firearms. But even then, there's like a lot of situations where even with the jail sentence, you could still buy a weapon. Because like if it's still under a year or something like that, you can still buy a weapon. So I think that's interesting because there's not like really complicated and thorough like background checks to actually like confirm that this person like should deserve a weapon or this person doesn't have like psychological issues or is not like domestically abusive or anything like that. Yeah, like I was mentioning, there is a background check which checks for prior convictions and like other red flags in your history, but this again, I feel like this like minors or like 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds, like really young people, they could easily pass this, but they could have like malicious intentions because as a minor, a lot of your records could be sealed or you could not be blamed for a lot of stuff you did and you could be like let off the hook. But you could still have done like malicious things and violent things, and that would not be considered in your history, but you would be able to get a weapon. So
and actually,
yeah.
I hope I'm not interrupting, but
I just
want to pop this in that actually the Uvalde shooter, this isn't a perfect example, I think, of like background checks maybe failing at some instances, is that in the Uvalde shooter, he actually never had a history of violence or something that could be penalized on the criminal record. But so effectively, if there was a background check going in the process, he would have likely passed this and still have been able to purchase his gun. So I just think that, again, and there are cases like this where even somebody with no criminal record can cause still a lot of mass shooting and a lot of grief in a city. So I just wanted to add that in because I feel like that just relates strongly with the point that you're making.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great addition. Like the thing about the background checks in the US, they're so not thorough that there's so many loopholes and little holes that people go through that they end up buying weapons and they might have malicious intentions and no one can do anything about it because all you need is background check. And also like about a third of gun owners can buy guns without a background check because they're getting it from private sellers, and the federal law does not require a background check when you're buying from a private seller in comparison to a public seller like a company, like I don't know, a gun shop or something like that. So even then, there's like so many people because like a third of the gun owners in the US is a very large amount. Like so many people are getting like checked, like thoroughly examined to make sure that they're not using this weapon for bad and they're only using it for like self-defense or hunting or something like that. And also, I think it's really interesting that you are given an immediate answer after your like about roughly 10-minute phone call on or online like process. while like finding a permit, while applying for a permit, because that's like such a short time in comparison to other countries like such as Australia and Austria. Australia has a 28-day policy where you have to wait 28 days after getting your permit before you can actually get your weapon. And similarly, Austria has like a 3-day cool-off period where you can only get your gun after the 3 days to reduce the likelihood of impulsive violence. So that kind of takes away the ability for people to get weapons like super easily and use them in like a fit of rage. But in comparison, America, you only have to really wait like 10 minutes or an hour really, and you could get your weapon immediately. And I think that might be a major issue. Like people could in anger, because in anger you can do a lot of stuff, and like people with mental issues as well, they could be going through a psychological break, but they could go through this process and they don't even have to go through the process, maybe even because some states don't require a permit, and they could just get a weapon and do whatever they want with it.
Honestly, in the and the like in government in general, the amount of people that suffer, like not suffer, favor supporting a law that requires a police permit, generally the numbers have been going down. Like I saw this statistic in which in 1972, right? There was like bipartisan agreement that about 75% of both like Democrats and Republicans favored a law requiring a police permit. And by 2022, so the year we're in currently, it's dropped down to like 60% almost. For both Democrats and Republicans, their percentages average. And as the years went on, I think we've been seeing an overall trend in like party polarization in which both the Republican and Democratic Party have been like pretty diametrically opposed on many issues. And with no doubt, gun laws is definitely not an issue in which they are in agreement. There's also a lot of polarization in this issue, but the amount by which the gap increases each year is only increasing. And there's a pretty evident split in who favors gun laws and who doesn't, which could make passing laws on gun regulations and like trying to at least try and like approach the problem harder. I know, especially after Uvalde, they've made the first step in trying to solve the issue, but with such polarization within Congress and just the government in general, it is going to be harder to get more and more laws requiring permits and more thorough background checks. Because as you said, there's like that 10-minute process for permits that doesn't really guarantee much, and it provides a very easy way for someone to get guns.
Yeah, definitely. Before we move on from this section, I would just like to point out Japan as a particular country that has a good process, because I kind of like thought this would be a great process for the US to begin to try to implement. Japan has like a written exam, and also they have to take a firearm class, so it's kind of just making sure they know how to handle a weapon and they know how to make sure they don't like accidentally set it off or like keep it near children or anything like that. Then they also have a police interview describing reasons they need to purchase a firearm, which I think is super important, because honestly, this police interview could take care of so many like violent people that would use this to like give harm to others, like in domestic abuse situations, or even like in school shooter situations. Like they would not be able to provide a reason other than their violent intentions. But in addition to this police interview, they also have to provide a doctor's note proving mental fitness and no drug abuse, which I think is also something that should be applied, because substance abuse is like, it can be overlooked really easily if it's not like super major that like they're like homeless and they're drug abusers, but they could be like active members of society and also drug abusers, and that can like cause a mental break. As we all know, like mental health is really, it can be broken really easily. So I think having that doctor's note to prove that you are fit for a weapon would be really important for decreasing the amount of violence that these weapons are used for. And also like applying for this permit takes up to a long time. So there's obviously like a month or so in wait, and that could also reduce like the impulsive violence that we've seen a lot recently in the US.
And yeah, actually.
No, I fully support what you said because.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry.
Sure,
Could
I would-
we let Isha speak? I think
Oh,
she
yeah,
hasn't
sorry,
spoken
yeah,
in a
go
while.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so kind of actually in connection with what you said about having to have a doctor's note to get guns. This is kind of similar to actually the red flag laws, which there's around 19 states that have them. And basically the red flag laws state that if someone if someone goes to a judge and says that a person is not fit to carry a gun, the judge is going to be able to legally say that this is how long that the gun can be taken away for, and it can be taken away for days, weeks, months, years. It really just depends on the time that the judge says. And this varies by state because some states, like Florida, for example, says that only the police are allowed to petition the courts to take away guns from other people. Whereas in other states, like such as New York, you can have mental health workers, or in other states, you can have even your coworkers can say that I don't think this person's fit to carry a gun. And if it passes in the court, then the judge can easily take away the person's gun. And while, of course, this seems like a good measure to have in place, it doesn't always work. Because even in New York, which is a widely Democratic state, which does push for greater gun legislation, it was actually shown that in Buffalo, the police had already been called on the perpetrator who had shot, who had shot and killed many people in Buffalo. When he was 17, the police had already been called on him, but they made no effort to petition the court to take away his gun. And so after that, of course, as we all know, he was able to commit and cause a mass shooting later. So we have some laws in place, and of course this isn't actually a statewide thing. It's only in around 19 states, which is obviously not a majority of the states in our country. So even though, again, laws like these can really help, it also widely depends on the individuals, and because it varies so much by state, it just depends on who is able to do it and if they are willing to take any action. And again, I think personally, this goes into also how, as the public, I kind of want to connect us also with the public, because I think that personally, one of the reasons that gun legislation is really hard to pass in the US, besides the obvious reasons of it's difficult between political parties, everyone has their own opinions, and such a polarized issue, is that if the public doesn't call for gun legislation to be passed, or even just any sort of legislation to be passed, nothing's going to get passed. If the public calls and continually persists for a certain type of legislation to be passed, inevitably the government will have to pass it, because the government in this country has to appeal to the public if they want to keep their jobs and continue working as government officials. So the issue is that if you think about it, how many news stations today are still talking about what happened in Uvalde, or still talking about what happened in Buffalo? And the answer is that most, if not almost all of them, don't really have anything to do with the shootings now. So even though I think that we do have to put some blame on the politicians at work, to organizations who oppose or call for gun legislation, we also have to look towards the public, who doesn't really make an issue out of it until something happens recently. And I think that's why after we recently have a mass shooting, that's when the public calls again. And that's why we have to keep asking ourselves, why does this always happen if a mass shooting happens? It's because that's when the stories are really circulating about the issue. And when stories aren't circulating about the issue, then nobody is going to care, and no one's going to really have a cause to pass the legislation.
No, I really like
I
that
want
point
to-
that you made, because yeah, it's totally true. Like, first of all, this guy was 17 years old, but again, it brings back into conversation about how minors are really, like, they aren't really prosecuted for any crimes or any signs of violence. They're just seen as kids and like not really like violent as they can be. But at the same time, once they turn 18, they have access to all these weapons and they can act on their violent tendencies. But instead, they're not reported. Even this red flag law is not even like put into place for these acts, because like the police is just ignoring it, because it's just like, oh, it's just a kid. They're a little hot tempered. They're a little immature, right? But then again,
See, that's the problem. In the US, the federally mandated drinking age is 21. It's 21 because they think that anyone under the age of 21 is not mentally mature enough to go out and drink and make sensible decisions, often having to do with like drinking and driving and violence and whatnot. If drinking itself is at 21, then how come we are giving someone, as soon as they turn 18, access to a gun? And I remember when you were talking about that entire thing with like the doctor's note and proving like they are mentally, physically, sane, and they're all clear on the thing. It's not like this process hasn't worked. This process works for so many people, and it works it works for driving, right? In order for you to get a driver's license, you need to take a test, you need to take a course, you need to have a certain amount of instructions, like with a certified instructor for a certain amount of time, and after that, you need to take multiple tests, and you also need to get your license renewed every 2 or 3 years, depending on what state you're living on. If it's
Yeah,
working, so many people with cars and trucks with literally like multiple ton trucks and cars, like those, like so many people die from car accidents each year, and by no means is like the driver's license program like by any means like completely effective. But in most states, before they were implemented compared to like after they were implemented, it definitely did work. So it's not like these policies don't work. We just aren't like implementing them in the right areas. Because essentially, I saw statistics in which more like gun violence has over like it's up to like the same amount of like car deaths, like deaths in like accidents and stuff. It's about the same for like gun violence. So if it's working for like cars and driving, and if we can teach, especially kids, to be like, kids our age and even people to be sensible, responsible drivers, if the government can do that, then I think to a certain extent they can also, by no means is this an effective solution. We can, better educate people about the uses of guns and also prevent them from doing harm to other people, because they can't use it unless they have a license or permit, and which makes
yeah,
like
Sam, sorry
the
to cut
regulation
in between you,
even
but
harder.
I can see your point totally, but I think we're running out of time a little bit for our recording. So I'd just like to move on a little bit because I know you researched a little bit between the NRA and politics, and I would really like to touch on that issue because I think we've discussed this topic enough.
Mhm. Yeah, and I know Isha was talking about how the public should also, and how this is like a trend in which the shooting happens like a couple weeks later, everybody's talking about it, and then it dies down, and then until it happens again until the next school shooting. But I want to really focus on is the NRA, which stands for the National Rifle Association. It is currently the biggest, I think it's the biggest
Gun
lobby
organization?
gun organization. It's like the most powerful and like well-funded special interest lobbying groups within the United States, and they do have quite a bit of popularity. They're one of the most popular lobbying groups, and their popularity only continues to rise. And most of these people who support the NRA are in the form of senators, representatives, congressmen and women. Um, and, as public, they have the opportunity to vote and elect the people who represent us in Congress. And, even after these many shootings, we can see that there's like these people who still are very like opposed against gun regulations and gun laws. They're still elected into power. It could also mean that from the public standpoint itself, there is still a lot of support for pushback against gun regulations, because I mean, what we only see on media is we see like the most vocally active of everybody, the ones who are very like, either you see the ones who are very, very opposed against gun laws, or very, very in favor of gun laws. And that often doesn't represent like the majority of Americans and their stance on gun laws.
Yeah, like the majority of Americans truly, I believe a lot of Americans do own guns, and they kind of fear that any regulation will end up taking their guns away and their right to defend themselves away. So no really political side really touches on that issue, and that's why a lot of gun regulations that are laws that are passed by, like, for now, let's say the Democratic side, it's kind of faces traction from the Republican side, because that Republican idea is to protect the Second Amendment to its fullest extent. The Democrats, some of them do agree with protecting the Second Amendment, but they also want to protect the people and pass a amount of legislation. And I think we really need to help the current government and help the current people to understand that legislation won't take away your guns, but it will help protect your people, you know?
Yeah.
And I
Um,
think
And
talking
I
about
want to add one
um,
thing. It's that according to like many numbers here, contributions from like the NRA do go to a lot of senators and House of Representatives, like representatives in the House, who support both. This is not just like a party issue. Both Democrats and Republicans support the NRA. Um, Obviously, you know, one party is known for supporting it a little bit more than the other, but essentially there is contribution. So maybe, you know, it could totally be that support of like pro guns and against gun regulations in terms of like their connections to the NRA and the fundings they get, mostly for like, and then elections and all that mess. That could also be a pretty strong reason as to why legislation in Congress doesn't get passed that often. And, you know, again, going back to the point, Congress is only getting polarized more and more by the day, and they doesn't really represent the majority of Americans, from what I believe. It could totally be that in general Americans are also starting to become very polarized, but
yeah,
with Congress itself, there's just a lot of like divides, and with so much divide and there's like not that much of a compromise, it's only going to be harder to push legislation forward, especially now that the NRA is actually planning on moving its headquarters from Virginia to Texas. And as we know, Texas is a pretty conservative Republican state, and it's been known to be like the protector of the Second Amendment. Which, by the way, I know the Second Amendment is, you know, it's listed in the Constitution. It's a constitutionally protected right that everybody has. But, you know, in the case, you know, society is changing. It's not the same as what the founding fathers had originally planned. In this case, it is causing a harm to society. So I think, you know, there should be a reevaluation exactly on what that right means under the, you know, rules of the Constitution.
yeah. So I think we can come to consensus that some regulations do need to be placed. I think that's about all the time we have today. So thanks for watching us. It was a great first episode. I'm really happy that we could have come together like this and truly share our thoughts.